If you are on fire to seek the true, the good, and the beautiful, if you love poetry or have any interest in it at all, this is the place to be. My name is David Franks, and I'm very excited to initiate a series on YouTube on poetry. I think it more crucial than ever that we grapple with the most basic questions of human existence in a time of crisis. And I have found in my own dark night that poetry is indispensable for enduring, for having a North Star through the wilderness that one has to wander through sometimes. And we often put off in the routine of our lives the confrontation with the questions about what it is we're here for, what does it mean to live a life well, what do we owe each other, how do we take care of each other, what may we hope for. So when there's a disruption of the routine, then we all the more must take seriously the opportunity to wrestle with the angel of these most persistent questions. And I want to put before us this monumental poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson for the next several sessions here. In Memoriam, AHH, one of his most crucial accomplishments. It is in memory of his dearest friend, whom he lost when they were both young. And that return to the first love, as it were, the ardor of our youth, is something that I think is necessary for getting through a life that is often very hard, full of harshness, and it's also full of wonder. And part of what it takes to get your heart to open up when it gets calloused over in a world that is often very cruel, what it takes to open up a heart is to have the flame of that first ardor rekindled, and in whatever way. If one thinks of the Divine Comedy of Dante, that first love of Beatrice, whom he saw first when he was 9, the journey of his life is somehow shaped in the providence of God in this form of this woman whom he will meet after he's gone through hell and through purgatory. So for each of us, this is the case, that somehow there is something we must access that is primal, deep, all-encompassing if we would pay attention to it. And that's what we need to find out. And I don't want to preempt that, even though I'm trained as a Catholic theologian. I don't want this to be an apologetic kind of endeavor, this series. It's really a question of all of us as humans being seekers, to be open to that thing that got us going in the first place, the wonder, the fire, the ardor of our first love, as it were, is a symbol. And In Memoriam of Tennyson puts that question before us because he's grappling with the loss of this dearest friend. And he's asking the question, what might we hope, given the background of just horrendous loss that is there in this world, even though also there, and part of that flip side is the beauty of poetry, but also in this world is great wonder, great beauty, great joy, deepest joy. And somehow those are inextricably related, and Tennyson will be communicating that through this poem. And one should never take any human being as a guru, as a master. Even a great poet is going to say a lot of things that maybe that are going to be off, as any of us. Whatever wisdom we've got is also mixed in with a lot of unwisdom, a lot of foolishness. So it's not a point here of mining this poem for answers as such, though there will be some. It is to allow ourselves to be woken up and to be trained, to have our heart trained a little more to hear the music of the world, and both the dirge and the psalms, the great cry of the heart, and in both sadness and ecstasy. So this is what I would like to do. Why I got turned on to Tennyson in this juncture is that I was preparing for a talk, a workshop on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which of course was postponed. But I was reading Hugh Kinner's book on Eliot, the Invisible Poet, and he said, if we want to understand better what is in working in the early poetry, especially of Eliot, we need to have the music of Tennyson in our ears, because that was indispensable background. And Tennyson is not a poet I've spent much time on in the past, and I am finding, reading through In Memoriam, that this is, it's just a great treasure, and I think you will find it to be so also. It is a poem of great scope. It's 131 cantos and a prologue and an epilogue, almost 3,000 lines. So my proposal is to work through this in the series with the counterpoint of several Eliot poems, especially early poetry of his. So today we'll counterpoint the first, the prologue, the first three or four cantos of In Memoriam with T.S. Eliot's Preludes, which is it's a remarkable poem of his youth. And I think you'll find it a stimulating experience, and one that I hope moves your heart as it moves mine. So In Memoriam was finished more or less in 1850. He lost his friend Arthur Henry Hallam, AHH, in 1833. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Vienna. They had met at Trinity College at Cambridge. Tennyson was 18 months older. Hallam was a poet also, and they became fast friends. They had 3 years of clearly a very intense friendship before Hallam died. And this was the decisive event of Tennyson's life. So for the next 16, 17 years, he worked on, as he produced a lot of other great poetry, he was working on this project. He would set aside the poems that would end up being in this epic work of lyric poetry to point out how interesting this project is, to juxtapose epic and lyric. He set aside what he was working on for In Memoriam by marking it off as in one certain stanzaic structure, A, B, B, A rhyme scheme in which you have the first and last lines rhyming and the middle lines rhyming with each other. And we'll talk a little bit of the meter here later on. So eventually these poems all were brought together, and he had it published anonymously in 1850. Tennyson was born in 1809 and he died in 1892. He was the great poet of the Victorian era. He was the poet laureate of Great Britain and Ireland during most of Queen Victoria's reign. His music is the music of the 19th century. That century was so crucial for us still, because obviously the Industrial Revolution still sets the parameters of the material civilization in which we live. And the ideological struggles of that time are still the struggles of our time. The Enlightenment and the Romantic reaction, these are the coordinates in which we still are plotted. So I think we'll find that it's interesting to see how In Memoriam looks in relation to Eliot's poetry, which is written a little later and at the beginning of what is obviously the modern period, certainly the modernist period of aesthetics, and see where in fact we haven't gotten beyond these questions. They're still our questions, and these are our coordinates. Let me read a few things that Tennyson was supposed to have said about this great poem. He says, "It must be remembered that this is a poem, not an actual biography. It is founded on our friendship, on the engagement of Arthur Hallam to my sister." And there I need to note that, in fact, one of the other bonds that linked Tennyson and Hallam was that Tennyson's sister Emily was engaged to marry Hallam, and this death occurred not long before their wedding was to happen. On his sudden death at Vienna, just before the time fixed for their marriage, and on his burial at Clevedon Church. The poem concludes with the marriage of my youngest sister, Cecilia. It was meant to be a kind of divine comedy ending with happiness. The sections were written at many different places, and as the phases of our intercourse came to my memory and suggested them, I did not write them with any view of weaving them into a whole, or for publication until I found that I'd written so many. The different moods of sorrow, as in a drama, are dramatically given, and my conviction that fear, doubts, and suffering will find answer and relief only through faith in a God of love. So that's an affirmation of Christian faith, which we'll see here. Again, this series is not meant just for Christians. I would hope to make this attractive to all, because the ground on which we are standing is the human ground of seeking. And even if one has a religious faith, if one is still not seeking it in some fundamental way, then one is falsifying even that faith. So I think you'll see that in this poem. Tennyson is grappling with how it is that you can be authentically a believer when you've got to face squarely the questions that every human has to face. So but as a Christian theologian myself, I will be able to explicate from a shared viewpoint with the author here sometimes. But sometimes I will present it in a more objective sense as something that within the context of his own worldview. The point is, even if one isn't a Christian, one can make a translation. What is it that is most transcendent? What transcends my own plans? What is it? And just they ask the question that we all must ask, even a believer must ask: is this God that I worship something I've created? This faith that I've been given, is it something that I have corrupted with my own self? And we all really must always be seeking. We must be asking questions, and above all, we must be thinking. One, and two, we must always have our heart continually opened up. And the thing about grief is that's one way that our heart can become raw again, human again, open again, in a way that it has to be if we're going to live humanly. He also says in another place, "It is rather the cry of the whole human race than mine." In the poem, altogether private grief swells out into thought of and hope for the whole world. It begins with a funeral and ends with a marriage, begins with death and ends in promise of a new life, a sort of divine comedy, cheerful at the close. It is a very impersonal poem as well as personal. Now we'll see this interplay throughout. One thing about reading poetry is that one cannot assume that even in the most confessional lyrical poetry that the persona of the speaker is the same as the author. There's always going to be some distance there at least, and usually it's a great amount of transmutation that has occurred. I will sometimes slip into the shorthand of saying this is Tennyson speaking, but you'll know what I mean. This friendship obviously is not the kind of friendship that we have as much experience with now, I believe, and to our discredit, I think, the kind of friendship between men here that was a platonic thing, intense. This is it's a beautiful thing. It's as he said it. Was a friend Jowett actually says about this, the never to be forgotten love, and that's not too much. If one has a great friend, no matter what sex that friend is, that's the thing to be cherished. It's one of those great graces, great gifts in life. And I will probably later read the very Victorian stricture that Hallam's father wrote about Shakespeare's sonnets. A lot of them were written to a young man, and he's clearly, I think, trying to limit feeling, and I think that is not the lesson one should learn from tragedy. All right, the beginning, the prologue of In Memoriam, and I will go over this one a little later after I read through the section. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thine are these orbs of light and shade. Thou madest life in man and brute. Thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him. Thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood thou. Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith, we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee. A beam in darkness, let it grow. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before, but vaster. We are fools and slight, we mock thee when we do not fear, but help thy foolish ones to bear. Help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began. For merit lives from man to man, and not from man, O Lord, to thee. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature whom I found so fair. I trust he lives in thee, and there I find him worthier to be loved. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. That's the prologue, and I want to make a few notes about meter here, and I'll use this well-loved IKEA kid board here. All right. So, it's the In Memoriam stanza, as it's come to be called, has the ABBA, love and prove. That's not a perfect rhyme, obviously. I'll note that about if you write poetry at all and you end up with a line, if you have a line that ends in love, you know there are very few perfect rhymes. You've got glove, above, dove, of. If you listen to Leonard Cohen's Dance Me to the End of Love, he runs through all of them, and it's kind of funny. So one thing is to do an imperfect rhyme, love and prove, face and embrace. Now normally the rhymes are perfect. So that's the rhyme scheme. The rhythm is iambic tetrameter. So it's unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, immortal, unstressed, stressed. So strong Son of God, immortal love. We're scanning the line. This is the scansion of the poem, and unlike classical poetry, Greek and Latin poetry, which determine meter, the rhythm of the thing based on the length of the vowels, in English, our poetry, our meter is based on the stress, the pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables. So we've got feet, unstressed, stressed, 4 feet, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, 4 of them. That's the tetrameter. And it's I am is ba-bump, unstressed, stressed, ba-bump, 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 strong Son of God, immortal love, because that is, Shakespeare wrote mostly in iambic pentameter. It's that the rhythm, the iambic rhythm is very much the predominant one in natural English speech. It's there. Almost all of my poetry, and virtually everything I write is in iambic one way or another. So I hope that you don't read it like strong Son of God, immortal love. You don't read it that way exactly, but it's there. The rhythm is there as a thing. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face. So you don't want to read it out according to the scansion, but it's there, and it helps to. It's very good when you pick up a poem to see if you can mark out the feet, because that helps to give you a sense of what the poet is doing. All right, so. Okay. Going through some of those lines, notice that you've got the address of the prologue is to Jesus, the Son of God. And Tennyson is putting in apposition the phrase immortal love, and that's unique. It's something one should take note of, because usually you've got the Son as the Word of God or as the wisdom of God, but here Jesus is love, and it's addressed to the Son, not to the Father. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace. And faith is just, what is faith? That's going to be throughout the poem. And he's emphasizing this in the prologue. The prologue itself was written in 1849, so this was one of the last things written in this sequence, this elegiac sequence. By faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. So this dialectic, this tension between what we can prove and what we believe, between faith and knowledge, especially in the context of the 19th century, when the question of evolution was very much coming to the fore, the scientific advances that were changing everything in the Industrial Revolution through engineering, that's still obviously a question for us, a deep question. Thine are the orbs of light and shade, the sun and the moon. Thou madest life and man and brute. Thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. This has the resonance of the proto-evangelium from Genesis. God says to Eve that she will bear a child who will, that Satan will strike his heel, the child's heel, and the child will crush his head. But here we've got a skull, and that skull is humanity, and it sounds like Jesus is stepping on our skull, as if in some kind of brutal put down. But if you look at paintings of the crucifixion, you've got the skull at the base of the cross. So the foot of Christ being on the skull would be, it seems to me, a reference to the sacrifice that Jesus is making to save man, the human race from death. And that's the next stanza. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him. Thou art just. And he's trying to convince himself of the thing that he believes, right? That there will be resurrection after death. There will be resurrection after death. You are just. We have eternity in our hearts. You made us. We weren't made to die. We know it. And God will resurrect. The next stanza, thou seemest human and divine. Very important, because seem shows up a lot. And obviously the word for us means that which appears, and usually means that which merely appears and is not really so. It's to have a seeming. It's not to be honestly what one is outwardly. But here it must be, thou seemest human and divine, the old meaning which we still have with seemly. That which is seemly is that which is most fitting. Thou who, Jesus, who are the seemliest human and the seemliest of the divine, the highest, holiest manhood, thou. And yet, by putting seemest there, which is a puzzle, and I think it would have been for someone reading then too, you'd have to figure out that this is what it means. So again, his faith in the divinity and the humanity of Jesus is something that is affirmed, but also, as it were, questioned. Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. And then you have these stanzas on the fact that whatever knowledge we've got, we have to submit them to a higher measure. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. Even in a world of immense technological power, as we see, we cannot control everything. And what a disaster it would be if we could. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but bright, broken lights of thee. And thou, Lord, art more than they. We have but faith. We cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see. And yet we trust it comes from thee. A beam in darkness, let it grow. Now, the question there is, what is it? What's the antecedent for it? And yet we trust it comes from thee. It could be faith, except the next line says, the next stanza, let knowledge grow from more to more. So We have but faith we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it. Knowledge comes from thee. A beam in darkness, let it grow. So now he's working back to give a space for knowledge, even though it's so hubristic. It strikes against that basis of believing. Let knowledge grow from more to more. It's in the proud triumph of modern civilization, right? But more of reverence in us dwell, and this is what we have to heed. That mind and soul according well may make one music as before, but faster. So placing that conclusion in the next stanzas to make it much more pointed. So the point of becoming more humble in our knowledge and our system building is that so that mind and soul, growing in accord, according well, may make one music as before. But here's the hopeful modern part, but it can be even a greater, a vaster music than before if we get this right. And that's a good sense of where we are in history, that there's always danger in one's position, but there's also promise, and we need to work on having the promise blossom. Mind and soul obviously is shorthand for knowledge and faith. Something about the split between science and religion is here, certainly. But more deeply, we've got a cultural situation in which our minds control everything. So when I say we should be thinking and questioning, that's a deeper thing than just the mind. It's something of the heart. The heart belongs to the soul, that which is inextricable from the body, that which is grounded and seeking at the same time. The mind is something disembodied, it's ghostly, and it's something that has a callousness about it, that wants to rule and control all things in its system. So we want to bring mind and soul into harmony. Somehow knowledge needs to be embraced, or knowledge must allow itself to be embraced by faith. And this means allowing ourselves to be second sometimes, that to know, to build, is to say, I'm going to control this, I'm going to be the one running the show. But sometimes we have to be contemplative, we have to receive, we have to listen, we have to be in solitude and be open. And that's where the soul is. The soul is here to listen, and it's a time now in our lives where we have to listen again, pay attention instead of being frenetic. And so we can hope for a vaster music than even before in ages when faith and knowledge may not have been so alienated from each other. We are fools in slight, we mock thee when we do not fear. So when we get too comfortable, we don't fear. It's that's one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is fear of the Lord. That isn't a sense of servile and craven cowering. It's a matter of recognizing that there's something transcendent. There's something that judges me, that I'm not the one in charge. And when I forget that, when I think, I am the ruler, I am satisfied, I determine how things go, well then one doesn't fear anymore, and then one becomes full of hubris. So we mock thee when we do not fear, not necessarily explicitly, but practical atheism, as it's called, is to live one's life as if there is not a higher measure. So God, we mock thee when we do not fear, but help thy foolish ones to bear, help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. That light comes presumably through knowledge, but necessarily it comes through faith too. And that all that light, all of that goodness that presses on us from above, it's too much for us to bear, and that's sometimes why we try to escape into our own created worlds, is because the depths of what we are called to do when we're responsible for each other, to take care of each other, that's something that is very hard for us to face. And even the abyss of light, how much goodness and beauty there is, well, that's overwhelming too. It's sometimes we just want to limit what we can actually face, and that's understandable. But in fact, we should allow ourselves to be opened up, because all of the wonder and the greatness of human existence is in that openness of heart and soul. So then he ends with 3 stanzas of asking forgiveness. Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began. And that's very paradoxical. Forgive what seemed my sin. If it's, again, there's that word seem. If it's just seeming sin, then he doesn't need forgiveness. I think the 2 lines together reveal what he's getting at. Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began. He's rebuking himself for not taking God's measure seriously and having his own standard instead. One thing we know, that he was crushed by harsh reviews at the time he was his friendship with Arthur Hallam was growing. Forgive what seemed my sin in me. Perhaps he's saying, forgive me for having the measure of my worth in my own hands and not paying attention to what it is that really mattered, what you had put right before me, right? This friendship itself. For merit lives from man to man. So he's talking about merit. That is, he was getting his sense of worth from how others judged him. And of course, that's natural. It's what we do. But I can try to earn my glory in the face of another human, but my meriting doesn't bridge that gap between myself and God. And so I think this is a stance of humility, where he's saying, I should submit to your measure. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature whom I found so fair. I trust he lives in thee, and there I find him worthier to be loved. Whether his grief needs to be forgiven, that's a thing he's going to be grappling with in this poem. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Again, is it wasted because he wasn't taking seriously the things that really mattered, what God was putting before him? Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. And here's again a wise man who's saying, don't take all of this poem and what it says as the truth. There will be failures of truth here, and that is very wise. Well, as you can tell by the erased board, there's been a jump in the footage. I'd hoped to get to cantos 1, 2, and 3, as well as the preludes of Eliot, but this half of the first session is already long enough, so I will split it into 2, and I hope to see you tomorrow. In this time of distress, this coronavirus pandemic, and our extraordinary measures to confront it, I wanted to provide this service and engage in this new venture as a way of dealing with the situation. So I hope to do a recording, or have a recording available every day, or at least every other day. That is my wish. As the kids say, click like and subscribe. It took me a while to realize that subscribing does not involve payment of any kind. I'm new to YouTube. So I hope that you all will do that you found this worth your time, and that it is worth your spreading the word. And I thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.